The coastal town of Shorebreak Point harbours many secrets beneath its salt-weathered buildings and cobblestone streets, but none greater than the truth behind Victoria Hargrove, the silver-haired widow who tends the lonely lighthouse at the edge of the jagged cliffs. To locals, she's just a fragile old woman with arthritic hands and fading eyesight who maintains the historic beacon as a living museum, sharing tales of maritime history with occasional tourists and schoolchildren. What no one suspects is that 40 years ago, Victoria wore a different name, Commander Viper Verdon, the legendary and ruthless leader of the Coastal Rangers, the most feared special operations unit ever assembled along the treacherous southern border. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 15 years, her tactical brilliance and uncompromising discipline struck terror into the hearts of drug cartels, militant groups, and corrupt officials alike. Now, as a new criminal syndicate infiltrates Shorebreak Point, Victoria's carefully constructed peaceful existence faces its greatest challenge. And these men are about to discover that the most dangerous thing about the former Commander Verdon was always underestimating her resolve. The morning fog clung to Shorebreak Point like a ghostly shroud, transforming the fishing town into a dreamy landscape of muted shapes and diffused light. Victoria Hargrove moved with deliberate slowness up the spiral staircase of the century-old lighthouse, each step a careful negotiation between determination and the limitations of her 76-year-old body. The brass lantern at the top required daily maintenance, polishing the reflectors, checking the electrical backup systems, and logging weather conditions as her lighthouse keeper predecessors had done for generations before the beacon was automated. The town below was just beginning to stir, fishing boats preparing to head out for the day's catch, the bakery's chimney sending tendrils of smoke into the misty air. From her elevated vantage point, Victoria could see it all through the lighthouse's glass enclosure, her eyes far sharper than her stooped posture and thick glasses would suggest. She noted the unfamiliar black sedan parked near the harbour master's office, the third new vehicle to appear in town this week, its windows tinted beyond what was strictly legal. Victoria's weathered hands moved methodically over the lighthouse equipment, her fingers bearing the distinctive calluses of someone accustomed to detailed work. To the occasional tourist, she appeared to be nothing more than an elderly caretaker, perhaps kept on by the historical society out of charity or tradition. Her white hair was always neatly pinned back, her clothes practical and unassuming, her manner gentle but reserved. Few people gave her much thought beyond appreciating the meticulous condition of the lighthouse museum she maintained. "Morning, Mrs. Hargrove," called a cheerful voice from below. Victoria descended carefully to find 12-year-old Ellie Martinez waiting at the lighthouse entrance, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mum sent these breakfast muffins over. She said to make sure you're eating properly." Victoria smiled warmly, accepting the small basket with a nod of appreciation. "Your mother is too kind, Ellie. Please thank her for me. Are you here for more stories for your school project?" The young girl nodded eagerly. "Mr. Peterson said my report on the lighthouse's role during the coastal smuggling era was the best in class. I was hoping you might have more documents I could look through." Victoria ushered the girl inside, her movements deliberately slow and careful, maintaining the persona she had crafted so meticulously over 2 decades. "I believe I found an old logbook from the 1920s that might interest you. It mentions several suspicious vessels the lighthouse keeper reported to authorities." As she retrieved the logbook from a glass-fronted cabinet, Victoria maintained her characteristic, unhurried pace, but her eyes never stopped their subtle scanning of the harbour, visible through the windows. The black sedan had been joined by another, similar vehicle. 4 men in casual clothing that couldn't quite disguise their military bearing were conversing with Brian Holcomb, the harbour master, whose family had managed the docks for 3 generations. "Mrs. Hargrove," Ellie's voice pulled her attention back. "Are you feeling all right?" Victoria patted the girl's hand reassuringly. "Just these old eyes getting distracted by the fog patterns. They create such interesting shapes on the water, don't they?" She opened the logbook to a marked page. "Now look here at this entry from March 1923. For the next hour, Victoria guided Ellie through historical accounts of the lighthouse's past, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of a practiced storyteller. If the girl had been more observant, she might have noticed how the elderly caretaker positioned herself to maintain sightlines to the harbour, or how her attention subtly shifted whenever new vehicles approached the town centre. But Ellie, like most of Shorebreak Point's residents, saw only what Victoria had allowed them to see for 20 years, a knowledgeable, somewhat frail widow who had appeared in town after her husband's death and taken on the lighthouse keeper's cottage when no one else wanted the isolated position. "Mrs. Hargrove," Ellie said as she carefully copied notes into her school journal, "did you hear about the new company buying up properties around the harbour? Mum says they're offering lots of money, but Dad doesn't trust them." Victoria's expression remained placid, though her mind instantly catalogued this information against other observations she'd made over the past weeks. "Change comes to every place eventually, dear. Though I admit I haven't paid much attention to business matters. At my age, the daily tasks of maintaining the lighthouse are quite enough to occupy me." This modest deflection had served Victoria well for years. The residents of Shorebreak Point respected her privacy and attributed her preference for solitude to grief over her late husband. A fictional naval officer she had invented as part of her carefully constructed background. What no resident of Shorebreak Point could possibly know was that the lighthouse's seemingly ordinary interior concealed sophisticated surveillance systems that monitored every approach to the town by sea or coastal road. The antique telescope displayed in the museum section contained military-grade optics that could read a boat registration number 3 miles offshore. The quaint keeper's cottage attached to the lighthouse base housed a secure communication system that could reach certain very specific individuals in various government agencies, if ever activated. For 20 years, Victoria Hargrove had maintained these systems with the same meticulous care she gave to the lighthouse itself, testing and updating them regularly, while ensuring they remained completely hidden from casual observation. 20 years of vigilant waiting for a threat she hoped would never materialize, but knew better than to discount entirely. After Ellie departed for school, Victoria locked the museum section of the lighthouse and made her way to the small garden, behind the keeper's cottage. To any observer, she appeared to be simply tending to her herbs and vegetables, her movements slow and sometimes halting as she knelt with apparent difficulty to pull weeds from between the neat rows of plants. In reality, this position gave her perfect sightlines to the harbour while appearing completely innocuous. The hearing aid she occasionally adjusted was not for amplifying sound, but contained a directional microphone that could pick up conversations at surprising distances when properly oriented. The men who had arrived in the black sedans were now speaking with Mayor Wilford outside the harbourmaster's office. Victoria adjusted her gardening hat and the microphone captured fragments of their conversation. "Nice exclusive development opportunity. Property acquisitions already underway. Significant economic benefits for Shorebreak. Concerns about historical zoning restrictions. Lighthouse preservation ordinance. Ways to accommodate everyone's interests. Modernization inevitable." Victoria's hands continued their steady work among the plants, nothing in her expression revealing the tactical assessment taking place behind her seemingly faded blue eyes. The pattern was familiar, She had observed similar operations during her years commanding the coastal ranges. First came the business representatives with their promises of economic development, followed by pressure on local officials, then systematic acquisition of key properties. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Once sufficient control was established, the true nature of the operation would emerge. The question was whether this was merely aggressive commercial development or something more sinister. Shorebreak Point's isolated harbor and minimal law enforcement presence had made it a favored smuggling location for generations before increased coastal patrols had shifted such operations farther south. Its potential value to criminal organizations remained significant if those patrols could be compromised or circumvented. As Victoria gathered a small basket of vegetables for her lunch, her mind processed multiple layers of intelligence and contingency planning. She had chosen Shorebreak Point with careful deliberation after orchestrating the official death of Commander Verdon in a classified operation gone tragically wrong. The remote lighthouse position provided legitimate reason for solitude, excellent surveillance capabilities, and multiple evacuation routes if ever needed. For 2 decades, the identity of Victoria Hargrove had been more than a cover. It had become a life she genuinely valued. She had grown attached to the town and its people in ways the hardened commander she once was would never have thought possible. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now faced potential threat to a community she had come to cherish, using the same tactical mind that had once made her the government's most effective weapon against coastal criminal operations. Inside her cottage, Victoria prepared a simple lunch while listening to the local radio station. The program was interrupted by a special announcement from Mayor Wilford about an upcoming town hall meeting to discuss exciting development opportunities presented by Atlantic Horizon Partners, a company specializing in luxury coastal properties. Victoria ate methodically while accessing mental maps of ownership patterns around Shorebreak Point's harbor. 3 critical properties had changed hands in recent months: the old cannery building, the marina's fuel depot, and the storage warehouses near the southern pier. All strategic locations for monitoring or controlling harbor traffic. The afternoon brought Margaret Sullivan, the town librarian and historical society president, knocking at Victoria's door with barely contained agitation. "Victoria, thank goodness you're home," Margaret began without preamble as soon as she was ushered inside. "Have you heard what's happening? This development company is trying to get the historical preservation ordinances modified. The lighthouse could be at risk." Victoria set about preparing tea with the measured pace of an elderly woman while processing this new information. "Surely the lighthouse's historical status is protected by state designation, not just local ordinances?" she asked, allowing concern to color her voice. Margaret sank into a chair at the small kitchen table. "That's just it. They've somehow fast-tracked a review of the state historical registry. They're claiming the lighthouse's historical significance has been overstated and that modernization would better serve the community." "How peculiar," Victoria murmured, setting out teacups with hands she allowed to tremble slightly. "Who would benefit from changing the lighthouse's status after all these years?" As Margaret detailed the complex legal maneuvers Atlantic Horizon Partners had initiated, Victoria listened with the focused attention that had once made her the most effective intelligence analyst in her unit. The pattern was becoming clearer. This was not normal commercial development, but a coordinated campaign targeting specific properties and regulatory protections. "The most troubling part," Margaret continued, lowering her voice though they were alone, "is that Sheriff Collins seems completely unconcerned. When I expressed worries about these outsiders and their aggressive tactics, he dismissed me entirely, said progress was inevitable and I should focus on preserving historical documents rather than buildings. Victoria noted this information with particular interest. Sheriff Collins had served Shorebreak Point effectively for 12 years. His sudden alignment with outside interests represented a significant shift in local power dynamics. Perhaps the development truly would bring economic benefits, Victoria suggested mildly, testing Margaret's reaction. Many of our young people leave for jobs in the cities. Margaret's expression hardened. That's what they want everyone to believe, but I've researched their previous revitalization projects in other coastal towns. Within 3 years, property values had risen so dramatically that original residents couldn't afford to stay. Local businesses were replaced by chain stores and tourist shops, and in every case, the promised community benefits somehow never materialized after construction began. After Margaret departed, Victoria secured her cottage door and activated a hidden panel behind an antique maritime painting. The technological sophistication of the equipment concealed there would have astonished anyone who knew Victoria only as the elderly lighthouse keeper. With practiced efficiency, she began running background checks on Atlantic Horizon partners through databases not accessible to the public. The company's structure revealed a complex web of shell corporations and offshore entities that triggered recognition patterns from her past life. This was not merely aggressive development, but a sophisticated operation designed to establish territorial control under the guise of commercial investment. As evening approached, Victoria completed her daily lighthouse maintenance routine, climbing the spiral staircase with the same careful movements she always displayed in public. From the lantern room, she observed 2 more black sedans arriving in town, their occupants taking rooms at Shorebreak's small inn. Through her enhanced optics, she studied these men with professional assessment. Their movement patterns, positioning, and environmental awareness suggested military or paramilitary training. They maintained communication disciplines consistent with coordinated security operations, rather than business executives. Victoria descended to her cottage and prepared for the night with the methodical precision that had defined both her command, career, and her cover identity. Tomorrow would require careful intelligence gathering before she could determine appropriate countermeasures. The threat was materializing more rapidly than she had anticipated, requiring accelerated preparation without compromising her carefully maintained persona. As darkness settled over Shorebreak Point, lights from fishing boats returning to harbor created dancing reflections on the water. Victoria observed the community from her window, noting how the black sedans, now positioned at strategic points throughout the small town, created subtle but significant disruption to normal patterns of movement. Residents modified their walking routes to avoid passing too close to these vehicles. Conversations became more guarded in public spaces. Attention began to infiltrate the formerly relaxed coastal community. The transformation was being orchestrated with professional efficiency. Within days, Atlantic Horizon partners had established presence, aligned with local authority, initiated regulatory modifications, and begun psychological operations to normalize their control. The approach bore striking similarities to territorial acquisition strategies Victoria had both countered and occasionally employed during her years commanding the coastal ranges. As she prepared for bed, Victoria allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. 20 years had passed since Commander Verdon had been officially declared dead after a classified operation along the southern border. 20 years of maintaining the identity of Victoria Hargrove, of performing the careful daily rituals that established her as nothing more extraordinary than an aging widow maintaining a historical lighthouse. The skills and capabilities that had once made her the government's most effective special operations commander had been deliberately suppressed beneath layers of constructed ordinariness. Yet they remained intact, preserved through private exercises and mental disciplines maintained away from public observation. Victoria had chosen Shorebreak Point as a retirement location with strategic calculation, never truly believing she would need to employ her former capabilities again. Now, as she observed the systematic infiltration of the town by forces whose patterns she recognized all too well, Victoria felt something awakening within her. The tactical mind that had once outmaneuvered the most dangerous criminal organizations. Along the coastal territories, Atlantic Horizon Partners and their paramilitary security force believed they were establishing control over a vulnerable small town with minimal resistance. They saw the lighthouse keeper as nothing more than an elderly obstacle to be removed through bureaucratic maneuvering. They couldn't be more mistaken. As Victoria extinguished her bedside lamp, her expression in the darkness held none of the fragility she projected to the world. The sharp, calculating focus that had once made hardened special forces operators follow her orders without question briefly surfaced before she deliberately suppressed it once more. Tomorrow would require perfect maintenance of her elderly persona while she gathered critical intelligence and assessed potential allies within the community. The commander had not survived 2 decades of high-risk operations by rushing into confrontation without proper preparation. Victoria Hargrove settled into sleep with the disciplined efficiency she applied to all aspects of her life. Her mind, already formulating preliminary response strategies while maintaining the appearance of a vulnerable old woman concerned about nothing more significant than tomorrow's weather and its impact on lighthouse visitors. Atlantic Horizon Partners had made a critical error in their otherwise professional operation. They had failed to properly research the elderly lighthouse keeper before targeting her position. That oversight would prove to be their most significant tactical mistake, underestimating the woman who had once been the legendary commander. Viper Verdon, whose strategic brilliance had dismantled criminal empires and whose operational planning was still studied in classified military programs. The battle for Shorebreak Point had begun, though only one side currently recognized the true nature of the confrontation. And in such asymmetrical engagements, awareness was perhaps the most significant tactical advantage of all. Victoria awoke. Before dawn, a habit ingrained through decades of military discipline that even 20 years of civilian cover hadn't erased. Unlike her public movements, in the privacy of her cottage, she moved with efficient precision, completing a series of exercises modified to accommodate her genuine age-related limitations while maintaining core strength and flexibility. The regimen wasn't visible in her physical appearance. She was careful to preserve the slight stoop and deliberate movements expected of someone her age. But it kept her capabilities significantly above what anyone in Shorebreak Point would suspect. Possible the night had brought new developments. Through her specialized equipment, Victoria had detected increased communications activity around the harbor. Encrypted transmissions that ordinary devices would miss entirely, but which her modified systems flagged immediately. The pattern suggested coordination beyond what a legitimate development operation would require, confirming her suspicions that Atlantic Horizon Partners served as front for something more concerning. Today would require careful intelligence gathering while maintaining her vulnerable facade. Victoria selected clothing that enhanced her elderly appearance, a cardigan slightly too large, creating the impression of a frame diminished by age, and her most obvious reading glasses. She arranged her white hair in its usual neat bun and activated the surveillance system that would record activity around the lighthouse during her absence. The morning fog had cleared by the time Victoria made her way into town, carrying a small basket as if on ordinary errands. Her pace was unhurried, her posture suggesting the careful movements of someone managing arthritic discomfort. To any observer, she appeared to be nothing more than the elderly lighthouse keeper on her weekly shopping trip. "Mrs. Hargrove." "Just the person I wanted to see," called Mayor Wilford, intercepting her near the post office. His usual jovial manner seemed strained, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I hope you'll be attending our town meeting tomorrow evening. Important developments to discuss regarding Shorebreak's future." Victoria noted the slight perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool morning, the way his gaze darted to a black sedan parked across the street. "I'll certainly try, Mayor," she replied, her voice carrying the slight tremor she had cultivated as part of her elderly persona. "Though these old legs don't much care for evening outings anymore." "This one's worth the effort," Wilford insisted, lowering his voice. "Particularly as it concerns the lighthouse. Mr. Harlan from Atlantic Horizon will be presenting their vision for revitalizing our historical properties, including some exciting modernization concepts for the Lighthouse Museum." Victoria allowed, alarm to show on her face, a calculated display of elderly distress. Modernization? But the Historical Society has always emphasized preservation of the original features. "Times change, Mrs. Hargrove," the mayor responded, his tone suggesting finality. "Preservation is admirable, but progress brings prosperity. Atlantic Horizon's investment could transform Shorebreak's economy." He checked his watch. "I must run to another meeting. Please do attend tomorrow, 4 o'clock at the community center." As the mayor hurried away, Victoria continued her leisurely progress through town, stopping at various shops that provided both cover for her presence and opportunities to gather intelligence. At each location, she presented the same carefully crafted image of a somewhat forgetful elderly woman while extracting valuable information through seemingly innocent conversation. At Jensen's grocery, she learned that Atlantic Horizon had already purchased the commercial fishing pier and was reviewing existing contracts with local fishermen. At the pharmacy, whispered concerns about unusual late-night deliveries to the old cannery building. At the hardware store, rumors that several waterfront homeowners had received offers significantly above market value, with implied threats about eminent domain possibilities for those who refused. The pattern was becoming clearer with each interaction: systematic acquisition of control points around the harbour, alignment with local authorities, and initial steps toward displacing resistant community members. Victoria had seen similar operations during her command years, though typically implemented by cartels rather than development companies. As she approached the harbour area, Victoria paused at a bench overlooking the water, allowing herself a moment of apparent rest while observing the increased activity around the old cannery building. Workers were installing new security features. Cameras with sweep capabilities far beyond what ordinary property protection would require, reinforced entry points, and what appeared to be signal jamming equipment disguised as standard telecommunications upgrades. Not quite the same old Shorebreak anymore, is it? Victoria turned to find Isaac Chen settling beside her on the bench. The retired Coast Guard officer had been one of the few residents who had shown immediate kindness when she first arrived in town 20 years ago. Now, in his early 80s, Isaac remained remarkably sharp-minded despite his physically frail appearance. "Change comes to every place eventually," Victoria replied non-committally, maintaining her cover even with someone she considered a potential ally. Isaac's weathered face creased with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Some changes happen naturally. Others get engineered by folks with particular interests." He nodded toward the cannery. 27 years patrolling these waters, I learned to recognize certain patterns. What they're setting up there isn't for luxury condominiums." Victoria assessed him carefully. Isaac had always demonstrated unusual perceptiveness, but this was the closest he had ever come to suggesting knowledge beyond what an ordinary resident might possess. She made a split-second decision to test the waters. "What do you see that concerns you?" she asked, her voice dropping the slight tremor she typically employed in public. Isaac noted the change immediately, his gaze sharpening as he studied her with new interest. Surveillance coverage of all harbor approaches. Communications equipment consistent with coordination of maritime operations, not construction projects. Security personnel with military bearing rather than standard private contractors. He turned to face her directly. "The question is, Victoria, what do you see?" For a brief moment, two professionals recognized each other beneath carefully maintained covers. Victoria made a precise calculation about how much to reveal. "I see a systematic acquisition of control points that would allow monitoring and management of all movement through Shorebreaks Harbor," she responded, her voice now carrying the crisp assessment tone of Commander Verdon rather than the soft uncertainty of the lighthouse keeper. "The operational pattern suggests preparation for secure transit operations, using the town's natural features to evade standard coastal monitoring." Isaac nodded, unsurprised by her transition. "Suspected as much about you for years," he said, quietly. "Never asked. Figured everyone's entitled to their retirement identity." He glanced around to ensure they weren't observed. "Coast Guard intelligence," he added simply. "Not officially retired, just positioned as observer for this sector." Victoria absorbed this revelation with the same tactical assessment she applied to all new information. Isaac's disclosure represented both opportunity and risk, a potential ally with relevant capabilities, but also a complication to her carefully maintained cover. "How compromised is the Sheriff's Department?" she asked, moving directly to operational concerns. "Collins is fully aligned with Atlantic Horizon. His two deputies are following orders without asking questions. State police jurisdiction is limited without specific cause for intervention." Isaac's briefing was concise, professional. Atlantic Horizon's security personnel include at least 6 with identified cartel connections, operating under false credentials. Victoria processed this intelligence rapidly. Timeline accelerated. Harbor control elements already in place. Community meeting tomorrow is theater to provide appearance of legitimate process while final property acquisitions are completed. Isaac shifted slightly, reaching into his jacket to extract a small thumb drive, which he passed to Victoria with practiced discretion. Maritime approach patterns for the past month. Unusual activities flagged. Victoria pocketed the drive with equally practiced casualness. "Your assessment of their ultimate objective?" Isaac's expression darkened. Shorebreaks' natural deep-water harbor with minimal regulatory oversight would provide ideal transit point for significant contraband operations. Existing legitimate businesses provide perfect cover for movement of personnel and materials. Once established, the operation could process 20 times the volume previously managed at southern points. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of 2 men from Atlantic Horizon, identified by the company logos on their casual but expensive attire. Both displayed the situational awareness and movement patterns of former military, confirming Victoria's earlier assessment. In an instant, she transformed back into the elderly lighthouse keeper, her posture stooping slightly, expression shifting to mild confusion as she fumbled with her shopping basket. "Good morning." The taller of the 2 men greeted them with professional courtesy layered over obvious assessment. "Ms. Hargrove, isn't it? The lighthouse keeper? I'm James Harlan, Development Director for Atlantic Horizon Partners." Victoria blinked up at him with apparent elderly uncertainty. "Oh my, yes, that's me. Though keeper is rather formal for what I do these days. Just a caretaker, really, since the lighthouse was automated years ago. Harlan smiled with practiced charm that didn't reach his eyes. Your role is an important connection to Shorebreak's maritime heritage. We're very interested in discussing how the lighthouse might feature in our revitalization plans for the harbor area. How lovely, Victoria responded, her voice quavering slightly. Though I'm just the caretaker, not the owner. The historical society would be who you'd want to speak with about any changes. Of course, Harlan acknowledged smoothly. We'll be presenting comprehensive plans at tomorrow's community meeting. I do hope you'll attend. Your historical knowledge would provide valuable perspective. His companion remained silent, but Victoria noted how his gaze systematically assessed both her and Isaac, his posture suggesting combat readiness despite the casual setting. This wasn't mere security, but tactical support, confirming that Harlan held significant position within Atlantic Horizon's actual command structure. I'll try my best, Victoria replied with seeming earnestness, though these old legs don't manage evening outings as well as they once did. We'd be happy to arrange transportation for you, Harlan offered, his tone suggesting this was not merely courtesy, but a means of ensuring her attendance. Oh, I couldn't impose, Victoria demurred. My neighbor usually gives me a ride when needed. After a few more exchanges of seemingly pleasant conversation, Harlan and his associate continued their walkthrough of the harbor area. Once they were safely distant, Isaac leaned closer to Victoria. Harlan is former Special Operations, discharged under classified circumstances. His real name is Javier Hernandez. He disappeared 8 years ago and was presumed dead until resurfacing. With Atlantic Horizon 3 years ago, Victoria absorbed this critical intelligence with outward calm. The community meeting will be their opportunity to identify potential resistance. Those who raise significant concerns will become targets for focused pressure or removal. Isaac nodded grimly. Standard procedure in their previous operations. First monetary incentives, then legal maneuvering, finally direct intimidation for holdouts. 3 people disappeared during their Pelican Bay development, officially recorded as relocations, but no subsequent records exist. As they parted ways with the casual farewell of elderly neighbors, Victoria maintained her unhurried pace and vulnerable appearance, while her mind processed multiple layers of tactical assessment. The situation was evolving more rapidly than initially calculated, with Atlantic Horizon's operation already transitioning from establishment to consolidation phase. Returning to the lighthouse, Victoria completed her caretaker duties with the same meticulous attention she always displayed. Publicly, once alone in her cottage, she activated counter-surveillance measures before accessing her secure communication system to verify Isaac's intelligence independently. The thumb drive contained exactly what he had indicated, detailed records of maritime traffic with specific vessels flagged for unusual patterns, consistent with surveillance or test approaches. The data confirmed Atlantic Horizon was establishing a sophisticated smuggling operation, using Shorebreak's natural harbor features to evade coastal monitoring. More concerning was confirmation of Harlan's true identity. Javier Hernandez had been on Commander Verdon's radar during her final years of active service, a highly capable operator who had transitioned from legitimate special forces to cartel employment. His presumed death had closed several ongoing investigations. His reappearance represented significant escalation in the threat assessment. Victoria activated a secure satellite connection to access deeply classified databases that technically no longer existed. Her authorization codes should have been deactivated decades ago, but certain contingency protocols remained operative for select former commanders, a fact known to very few outside the highest levels of government. The information she retrieved confirmed her worst suspicions. Atlantic Horizon Partners was a sophisticated front for a coalition of criminal organizations seeking to establish a new trafficking route following increased enforcement pressure along traditional corridors. Their previous development projects had created similar operations in 3 coastal locations, each disguised as luxury resorts or marinas, while facilitating movement of contraband worth billions annually. Victoria methodically compiled this intelligence while formulating initial response strategies. The immediate challenge was maintaining her cover identity while implementing countermeasures against an organization with significant resources and tactical capabilities. Direct confrontation would be suicidal given the current force imbalance, but strategic application of her specialized knowledge could disrupt their timeline and create opportunities for more comprehensive intervention. As evening approached, Victoria completed her daily lighthouse maintenance routine, climbing the spiral staircase with the same careful movements she always displayed publicly. From the lantern room, she observed additional security personnel arriving in shorebreak, taking positions that effectively established surveillance coverage of all significant community gathering locations. Atlantic Horizon was preparing for tomorrow's meeting by ensuring they could identify and track any residents who might present organized resistance. The tactical approach was professional, thorough, and indicated they anticipated potential opposition beyond normal community concerns about development. Victoria descended to her cottage and prepared for the night with methodical precision, her mind simultaneously developing multiple contingency plans. Tomorrow's community meeting would represent a critical decision point. Her actions there would either maintain her cover as a vulnerable elderly caretaker or initiate a more direct counter-strategy. What Atlantic Horizon couldn't possibly know was that they were facing the one person whose tactical expertise exceeded their own, the legendary commander whose strategic brilliance had dismantled criminal networks across the coastal territories for 15 years before her orchestrated disappearance. As Victoria reviewed detailed maps of Shorebreak Point and its surrounding waters, her expression held none of the frailty she projected to the world. Tomorrow would require perfect balance between maintaining her elderly persona and implementing initial countermeasures against an organization that represented genuine threat to the community she had come to cherish during her 20 years of peaceful retirement. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now prepared to protect a small coastal town using the same tactical mind that had once made her the government's most effective weapon against criminal organizations, very similar to Atlantic Horizon. The commander had never sought to return to active operations, but she would not stand by while Shorebreak Point was systematically corrupted and exploited by forces whose methods and objectives she understood all too well. Victoria Hargrove, once Commander Viper Verdon, checked her specialized equipment one final time before settling into sleep with the disciplined efficiency she applied to all aspects of her life. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a confrontation Atlantic Horizon had never anticipated when they selected Shorebreak Point as their next operational base. Their most significant tactical error was already made. They had failed to recognize that the seemingly vulnerable old woman who maintained the lighthouse possessed the most dangerous mind they would ever encounter. The community center hummed with unusual tension as Shorebreak Point's residents filed in for the special town meeting. Victoria arrived deliberately late, allowing herself to be guided to a seat in the back row by Margaret Sullivan, the town librarian. This positioning gave her optimal sightlines to observe both the Atlantic Horizon representatives on stage and their security personnel strategically positioned throughout the room. "Quite the turnout," Victoria murmured to Margaret, her voice carrying the appropriate elderly tremor while her eyes catalogued each face with professional assessment. Nearly 200 residents had gathered, almost the entire adult population of Shorebreak Point, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. "People are worried," Margaret whispered back. "The Historical Society spent all morning trying to contact the State Preservation Office, but couldn't get through. It's like someone's blocking all our attempts to get outside assistance." Victoria nodded sympathetically while mentally confirming this aligned with standard isolation tactics. Atlantic Horizon was systematically cutting Shorebreak Point off from external resources that might interfere with their acquisition timeline. Mayor Wilford approached the podium with the forced enthusiasm of someone under significant pressure. "Friends and neighbors, thank you for coming to this important discussion about Shorebreak's future. We're fortunate to have Mr. James Harlan from Atlantic Horizon Partners joining us to present their visionary development plan for our harbour district." As Harlan took the stage with practiced corporate confidence, Victoria observed subtle security, repositioning around the room. 3 men with communications earpieces had moved to cover the main exits, while 2 others established positions providing clear sightlines to anyone approaching the stage. The formation suggested anticipation of potential confrontation rather than standard event security. "Good evening, Shorebreak Point," Harlan began, his voice carrying the smooth assurance of someone accustomed to public persuasion. "I'm honored to share Atlantic Horizon's vision for revitalizing your historic harbor while respecting its unique character and maritime heritage. The digital presentation that followed was professionally crafted to overwhelm with promised benefits: artistic renderings of modernized waterfront properties, projections of increased tourism revenue, plans for infrastructure improvements, and employment opportunities. Victoria noted how carefully the presentation obscured actual ownership transitions and operational control mechanics beneath layers of aesthetic improvements and economic projections. "The centerpiece of our heritage preservation efforts," Harlan continued, gesturing to a rendering that appeared on the large screen, "will be the transformation of your historic lighthouse into an interactive maritime museum with modern educational facilities and the observation deck offering dining with panoramic coastal views." A murmur ran through the audience as the rendering showed the lighthouse significantly altered, with glass-walled additions and structural modifications that would effectively eliminate its historical integrity while providing clear surveillance. Positioning over the entire harbour, Victoria allowed appropriate concern to show on her face while noting Margaret Sullivan's hand shooting up among others in the audience. Harlan acknowledged the librarian with polished courtesy. "These plans would completely destroy the lighthouse's historical designation," Margaret stated, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The structure has remained architecturally intact since 1886. These modifications would invalidate its protected status under state preservation guidelines." Harlan's smile remained unwavering. "We've consulted with preservation experts who believe our approach represents an optimal balance between historical respect and modern functionality. The core structure remains recognizable while allowing for safety improvements and visitor amenities that the current configuration simply cannot support." Before Margaret could respond, Victoria noticed 2 of Atlantic Horizon's security personnel, photographing the librarian and others who had visibly reacted to the lighthouse plans. They were creating a catalogue of potential opposition figures for targeted pressure, exactly as she had anticipated. The question and answer session that followed revealed the community's growing division. Some residents, primarily business owners along the harbour, expressed enthusiasm for increased tourism and property values. Others, mostly long-time residents with generational ties to Shorebreak Point, voiced concerns about environmental impacts, historical preservation, and affordable housing for local families. Throughout the increasingly heated discussion, Victoria maintained her role as the unassuming lighthouse keeper, never raising her hand or drawing attention. Her decades of tactical experience had taught her that visible opposition at this stage would merely mark her for focused elimination. Instead, she meticulously observed the interaction patterns, identifying which residents appeared most vulnerable to pressure and which demonstrated potential for organized resistance. Most significantly, she studied the operational behavior of Atlantic Horizon's security team, memorizing their communication protocols, positioning preferences, and response patterns. Each detail provided valuable intelligence for the countermeasures she was already formulating. The meeting concluded with Mayor Wilford announcing the formation of a community advisory committee to provide input on the development process. A transparently hollow gesture given Atlantic Horizon's already established timeline and property acquisitions. As residents began filing out, Victoria noticed three distinct patterns emerging. Some residents clustered around Harlan, eager to establish favorable positions in the changing power structure. Others gathered in concerned groups, voices low but expressions resolute. A third contingent departed quickly, heads down, already surrendering to what they perceived as inevitable transformation of their community. "What do you think, Victoria?" Margaret asked, as they slowly made their way toward the exit, the librarian unconsciously adjusting her pace to match the elderly lighthouse keeper's apparently careful steps. Victoria allowed genuine concern to show in her expression. "Change comes to every place eventually," she replied, loud enough to be overheard by nearby Atlantic Horizon personnel. "At my age, I've learned to accept what cannot be altered." The response was perfectly calibrated, the resigned acceptance expected of an elderly woman faced with overwhelming corporate power. The security officer, who had been monitoring their conversation, visibly relaxed, mentally relegating Victoria to the no-threat category and shifting his attention to more vocal opponents. Outside the community center, Victoria parted from Margaret, with a promise to attend the hastily organized Historical Society emergency meeting the following day. As she made her way along the harbor path toward the lighthouse, she noted a black sedan tracking her movement at discreet distance. Standard surveillance protocol to document her routine patterns. Victoria maintained her unhurried pace and slightly stooped posture, presenting the perfect image of an elderly woman lost in troubled thoughts after a concerning community meeting. Only when she had entered her cottage and activated counter-surveillance measures did she allow her posture to straighten and her movements to adopt the crisp efficiency of Commander Verdon. What she had observed at the meeting confirmed her initial assessment. Atlantic Horizon was implementing a sophisticated territorial acquisition operation using commercial development as cover for establishing a major smuggling waypoint. Their approach combined legitimate business tactics, regulatory manipulation, and targeted intimidation, all orchestrated with professional precision that suggested direction from experienced cartel strategists. Victoria activated her secure communication system, transmitting encrypted updates to Isaac Chen with her assessment of the current situation and preliminary countermeasure recommendations. The retired Coast Guard intelligence officer represented a crucial ally, but his visible position in the community limited his operational capabilities. Victoria would need additional resources. With methodical precision, she prepared 3 distinct communication packets using an encryption protocol known only to former commanders of her specialized unit. Each message contained precisely calibrated information that would activate specific responses without revealing her location or current identity. She had maintained these emergency channels for 20 years without ever expecting to use them, a precaution that now proved prescient. As she completed these communications, a notification from her perimeter security system alerted her to movement approaching the lighthouse from the harbour side rather than the main path. Victoria immediately switched to surveillance mode, accessing camera feeds that showed 3 men in dark clothing, making a careful approach using terrain features for concealment. Their movement patterns and equipment indicated professional tactical training. This wasn't random intimidation, but a coordinated reconnaissance operation. Victoria recognized standard cartel infiltration methodology: initial surveillance before determining optimal pressure points or elimination approaches for resistant targets. She had anticipated this development, but not its accelerated timeline. Atlantic Horizon was moving faster than standard operational protocols would suggest, indicating either external pressure or recognition of potential opposition beyond ordinary civilian resistance. Victoria made rapid tactical calculations. Direct confrontation would compromise her cover identity and eliminate her most significant advantage, being underestimated by her opponents. Evasion would preserve this advantage, but potentially place her lighthouse position at risk. A third approach was required. With swift efficiency, she activated contingency measures installed during her 2 decades as lighthouse keeper. Specialized equipment emerged from concealed compartments, not weapons, but sophisticated countermeasures designed for precisely this scenario. As the infiltration team approached her cottage, Victoria transformed herself with practiced speed. The alert, tactical commander disappeared beneath layers of practiced behavior. Her posture stooped further, her movements became slightly erratic, and she adjusted her appearance to suggest an elderly woman preparing for bed, unaware of any threat. When the first infiltrator reached her kitchen window, what he observed through his tactical optics was exactly what Victoria intended. A fragile old woman shuffling around her cottage in a nightgown and robe, taking medication with trembling hands, occasionally talking to herself as she went through an evening routine. Victoria monitored their surveillance through her own counter systems, noting their communication patterns and assessment protocols. After 40 minutes of observation, the team withdrew without attempting entry or contact, exactly as she had calculated. Their mission had been intelligence gathering rather than direct action, and they had categorized her as a non-threat, requiring no immediate attention. Once they had cleared her perimeter sensors, Victoria returned to her secure communication system to complete her final transmission. The infiltration team's presence confirmed Atlantic Horizon's operational timeline was accelerated beyond normal parameters, necessitating more direct countermeasures than she had initially planned. At precisely midnight, Victoria activated the most secure communications protocol in her arsenal, a satellite uplink disguised within the lighthouse's weather monitoring equipment. This channel connected to a single recipient, a former coastal ranger whose specialized skills would be crucial for the coming confrontation. The message was brief, containing only a location code and authentication sequence, followed by a single phrase: "Lighthouse needs maintenance." To anyone else, it would be meaningless. To Commander Marcus Rivera, former demolition specialist and Victoria's most trusted lieutenant during her years commanding the coastal rangers, it represented an activation order he had never expected to receive. With the communication complete, Victoria methodically prepared for the next phase of her response. Atlantic Horizon believed they were executing a standard acquisition operation against an unprepared civilian population. They had no way of knowing they had triggered a countermeasure protocol designed by the most sophisticated tactical mind they would ever encounter. Morning brought steady rain to Shorebreak Point, reducing visibility and creating natural cover for movement throughout the small coastal town. Victoria used these conditions to her advantage, making her way to the Historical Society's emergency meeting via an indirect route that allowed her to confirm surveillance patterns around key community locations. Atlantic Horizon had established Comprehensive coverage, with observation teams monitoring the movements of identified opposition figures and security checkpoints controlling access to recently acquired properties. The operational discipline suggested paramilitary training beyond standard corporate security, confirming Victoria's assessment that Atlantic Horizon's true purpose involved significant criminal enterprise requiring military-grade protection. The Historical Society meeting was being held in Margaret Sullivan's home rather than the library, a precaution that indicated growing awareness of Atlantic Horizon's surveillance operations. Victoria arrived deliberately late, using her age as natural excuse while actually ensuring she wasn't followed. 12 concerned citizens had gathered in Margaret's living room, their expressions reflecting varying degrees of worry and determination. Victoria recognized most as long-time residents with deep connections to Shorebreak Point's history and community, exactly the demographic Atlantic Horizon would target for removal or neutralization. "Victoria, thank you for coming," Margaret greeted her with evident relief. "We weren't sure if it would be too difficult for you in this weather." "Some things are worth the effort, dear," Victoria replied, maintaining her elderly persona while assessing the group's composition and potential capabilities. Among those gathered, she noted Thomas Jenkins from the hardware store, whose military service in his youth might provide useful skills. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's only physician, whose position gave her access to all residents, and retired Judge Robert Holloway, whose legal expertise and connections could prove valuable. "We were just discussing possible legal challenges to Atlantic Horizon's permits," Margaret explained, helping Victoria to a comfortable chair. "Judge Holloway believes there may be procedural violations we could leverage to force regulatory review." The judge nodded solemnly. "Their environmental impact statements contain significant omissions regarding the harbor dredging required for their marina expansion. Unfortunately, filing formal challenges requires access to county offices, and my sources indicate Atlantic Horizon has established considerable influence with local officials." Victoria listened as the group outlined various resistance strategies, legal challenges, media outreach, appeals to state authorities. All legitimate approaches that would ultimately prove ineffective against an organization operating with Atlantic Horizon's resources and criminal methodology. What these good people didn't understand, but Victoria recognized immediately, was that they weren't facing a standard corporate development with regulatory corners being cut. They were confronting a sophisticated criminal enterprise with contingency, plans for every conventional opposition strategy, and willingness to employ escalating force against persistent resistance. "If I may," Victoria said during a brief lull, her voice carrying the slight quaver expected of her age, "I've lived through many changes in my years. Sometimes the most effective approach isn't direct opposition, but rather ensuring one has accurate information about what's truly happening." The group turned to her with polite attention, clearly not expecting significant strategic input from the elderly lighthouse keeper. "What do you mean, Victoria?" Margaret asked. Victoria carefully calibrated her response, providing tactical guidance disguised as elderly wisdom. "When my late husband was in the Navy, he often spoke of how intelligence gathering preceded any important operation. Perhaps before filing challenges that might alert Atlantic Horizon to our concerns, we should document exactly what they're doing at the harbor when they think no one is watching." Judge Holloway leaned forward with new interest. "That's actually, and quite insightful, Mrs. Hargrove, documented evidence of activities contradicting their stated development plans would significantly strengthen any legal challenge." Victoria nodded with apparent elderly satisfaction while subtly directing the group toward activities that would support her larger counter-strategy rather than exposing them to immediate risk. Perhaps those with particular skills could form Small teams focused on different aspects: property records, financial transactions, nighttime harbor activities. As the meeting progressed, Victoria guided the discussion with carefully placed suggestions that shaped the community's resistance, efforts into patterns that would complement rather than compromise her own operational planning. By the session's end, the group had organized into specialized teams with specific intelligence-gathering assignments that would provide valuable information while keeping them away from Atlantic Horizon's most dangerous activities. When Victoria departed 2 hours later, she carried not only valuable intelligence about community resources, but also the satisfaction of having established a civilian information network that would operate parallel to her own more specialized countermeasures. What Atlantic Horizon couldn't possibly anticipate was that their seemingly routine development project was now being systematically analyzed by both concerned citizens and a legendary special operations commander implementing highly specialized tactical response. The pieces were being positioned. The coming days would determine whether Shorebreak Point remained an independent coastal community or became another conquered territory in Atlantic Horizon's expanding criminal empire. The coastal fog rolled in with unusual density 3 days after the community meeting, shrouding Shorebreak Point in a grey blanket that reduced visibility to less than 20 yards. For Atlantic Horizon's security personnel, the weather created surveillance complications and communication challenges across their established perimeter. For Victoria Hargrove, it provided perfect operational conditions. Under cover of natural concealment, a nondescript fishing boat approached the rocky shoreline half a mile north of the lighthouse, well away from Atlantic Horizon's harbor monitoring systems. The vessel's engine was muffled, its navigation lights extinguished, its approach timed precisely with tide patterns that masked its acoustic signature against the natural sounds of waves against rock. Victoria observed the landing through specialized optics that penetrated the fog where normal vision failed. The boat's single occupant secured the vessel with practiced efficiency before making his way inland, using terrain features for concealment. Even without seeing his face, Victoria recognized Commander Marcus Rivera by his movement patterns alone, the distinctive efficiency that had once made him the Coastal Ranger's most effective infiltration specialist. 30 minutes later, a soft knock at her back door confirmed his successful navigation of Atlantic Horizon's security perimeter. Victoria admitted him quickly, securing the entrance behind him as Rivera removed his weatherproof gear. At 58, Marcus Rivera remained physically imposing despite the silver threading through his close-cropped hair. His weathered face showed momentary shock as he took in Victoria's elderly appearance, the physical transformation of his former commander more complete than he had anticipated, despite intellectual awareness of her cover identity. "Commander," he acknowledged with quiet respect, automatically straightening to attention despite the 20 years since their last operation together. "That title retired with me, Marcus," Victoria responded, her voice carrying none of the quaver she employed in public. "Victoria will do." She gestured him toward the cottage's small kitchen table, where maps and surveillance data were precisely arranged. Situation briefing first, then operational planning. For the next hour, Victoria detailed Atlantic Horizon's activities, capabilities, and apparent objectives with the same tactical precision that had characterized her command briefings decades earlier. Rivera listened without interruption, his trained mind processing the intelligence with professional assessment. "Cartel methodology with corporate resources," he observed when she concluded. "Sophisticated hybrid operation using legitimate development. As cover for establishing a major trafficking waypoint, the harbor's natural features, combined with local control, would allow them to move significant volume beneath regulatory oversight. Victoria nodded, pleased by his quick grasp of the essential threat pattern. "Assessment of available opposition resources?" she prompted, testing his tactical evaluation of the intelligence she had provided. Rivera considered briefly. "Limited. Local law enforcement compromised. Community resistance disorganized and lacking tactical capabilities. Coast Guard presence minimal and subject to jurisdictional limitations without evidence of criminal activity. Your contact Chen provides intelligence value but limited operational capacity due to age and visibility. Accurate but incomplete." Victoria corrected mildly. "You've overlooked 3 significant resources." Rivera reassessed immediately. "The historical society network you've established provides distributed intelligence gathering. The arriving fishing season brings additional maritime traffic that complicates Atlantic Horizon's monitoring capabilities." He paused, studying Victoria. "With sudden understanding, and your lighthouse position provides strategic observation of all harbor activities while appearing non-threatening." Victoria allowed a slight smile. "Precisely. Now, assessment of our most significant vulnerabilities." "Timeline pressure," Rivera responded without hesitation. "Atlantic Horizon's accelerated acquisition schedule suggests external factors driving operational urgency. We need to delay their consolidation phase long enough for documented evidence of criminal activity to justify official intervention. And our tactical disadvantage in direct confrontation," Victoria added. "Their security force outnumbers us, approximately 15 to 1, with superior armament and established positional control." Rivera nodded grimly. "Not favorable odds for conventional opposition." "Fortunately," Victoria replied, her eyes showing a glimmer of the strategic brilliance that had once made her legendary among special operations commanders. "We have no intention of engaging in conventional opposition." She unfolded a detailed, operational plan that caused Rivera's eyebrows to rise with professional appreciation. For 2 decades, Victoria had maintained the appearance of a harmless elderly lighthouse keeper while secretly developing contingency strategies against precisely this type of threat. Her plan combined sophisticated intelligence gathering, targeted technological disruption, and strategic application of carefully managed chaos, all designed to delay Atlantic Horizon's timeline while exposing their criminal activities without revealing her true capabilities. "Phase 1 implementation begins tomorrow," Victoria concluded. "Atlantic Horizon expects the Historical Society to pursue ineffective legal challenges while they complete harbor modifications. Instead, they'll face unexplained equipment failures, documentation discrepancies, and regulatory complications arising from multiple sources with no identifiable point of opposition to target." Rivera studied the plan with growing admiration. Distributed resistance rather than centralized confrontation. They'll be fighting shadows while revealing their true operational patterns through their response priorities. He looked up at his former commander with newfound respect. 20 years of retirement haven't dulled your tactical planning, Commander." Victoria's expression remained focused. "I never truly retired, Marcus. I simply redirected my operational priorities." She gestured toward the window, where the lighthouse beam swept through the fog at regular intervals. "This community provided sanctuary when I needed to disappear. Now it requires protection from forces employing methods we once opposed along different coastlines." As dawn approached, Rivera departed, using the same carefully planned route that had brought him to the lighthouse, carrying specific assignments and communication protocols. Victoria returned her cottage to its normal appearance, removing all evidence of tactical planning before resuming her elderly lighthouse keeper persona. The morning brought a significant development that aligned perfectly with Victoria's strategy. Margaret Sullivan arrived at the lighthouse shortly after 9, her expression animated with discovery. "Victoria, you won't believe what Thomas Jenkins found while reviewing the county property records," she began as soon as she was inside. "Atlantic Horizon's acquisition paperwork contains serious discrepancies. The corporate entities listed on different documents don't match, and the ownership chain leads to offshore companies that appear to be shells." Victoria allowed appropriate surprise to show on her elderly features. "My goodness, that seems quite irregular. What does Judge Holloway think this means?" "He believes it could be evidence of money laundering or tax evasion," Margaret explained excitedly. "Thomas is making copies of everything before the records mysteriously disappear, which is exactly what happened in Pelican Bay during Atlantic Horizon's development there." Victoria nodded with apparent elderly concern, while inwardly noting how perfectly this citizen-discovered intelligence complemented her operational timeline. The documentation discrepancies her historical society network had uncovered were not accidental. They were carefully manufactured evidence she had planted through digital manipulations executed via her specialized equipment. "What will you do with this information?" Victoria asked, maintaining her role as concerned but somewhat confused elderly observer. "Judge Holloway is preparing formal inquiries to both the State Financial Regulatory Commission and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division," Margaret replied. "He's using his judicial contacts to ensure the complaints can't be easily dismissed." Throughout the day, Victoria observed increasing activity around Atlantic Horizon's headquarters at the old Cannery building. Multiple vehicles arrived carrying what appeared to be legal representatives, based on their formal attire and document cases. Arlen himself made several agitated phone calls from his vehicle rather than his office, a security precaution that suggested concern about potential surveillance of their indoor communications. By mid-afternoon, Atlantic Horizon's security protocols had visibly tightened, with additional personnel positioned around key properties and communication frequency increased between surveillance teams. Their reaction confirmed Victoria's assessment. The organization was highly sensitive to regulatory scrutiny that might expose their financing structure. Phase 1 implementation was proceeding exactly as planned. The Historical Society's legitimate concerns about property records had created initial disruption while revealing Atlantic Horizon's response patterns. Now, Phase 2 could begin. Targeted technological interference with their secure communications network. That evening, Victoria activated specialized equipment disguised within the lighthouse's navigation systems. The technology, far beyond what a retired lighthouse keeper could reasonably possess, had been installed gradually over her 20 years in Shorebreak Point, creating a sophisticated signals intelligence platform beneath the historical facade. Tahua system began generating precisely calibrated interference patterns targeting Atlantic Horizon's encrypted communications without disrupting standard telecommunications used by the town's residents. The effect would be subtle but increasingly problematic, causing unpredictable failures in their coordination capabilities while creating uncertainty about the source of the disruption. Victoria monitored the initial results with professional satisfaction. Within hours, Atlantic Horizon security teams began experiencing communication difficulties that forced them to modify patrol patterns and checkpoint procedures. The disruption wasn't catastrophic. That would trigger immediate countermeasures and potential violence, but created sufficient operational friction to impact their timeline and resource allocation. Shortly before midnight, Victoria detected a significant development through her surveillance network. 3 boats with blacked-out navigation lights approached the harbor from offshore, maintaining communication silence but demonstrating coordinated movement patterns consistent with professional maritime operations. Through specialized optics, she observed the vessels docking at Atlantic Horizon's newly secured pier, where security personnel established a perimeter, while workers unloaded numerous waterproof containers with practiced efficiency. The operation was executed with military precision under conditions designed to evade normal coastal monitoring. Victoria documented everything, capturing high-resolution imagery and signal metadata that would provide conclusive evidence of unauthorized maritime activity inconsistent with legitimate development operations. This intelligence would be crucial for justifying official intervention, but required careful handling to protect her cover identity and the community members assisting her counter-operation. The following morning brought the first indication that Atlantic Horizon had detected opposition beyond normal community resistance. Victoria observed increased counter-surveillance activities around town, with security personnel conducting electronic sweeps of public buildings and establishing new observation points covering approaches to the lighthouse. Their tactical response confirmed Victoria's assessment. They had identified signal interference but couldn't precisely locate its source, leading them to implement broader security measures while searching for the disruption's origin. This divided their resources and attention exactly as her strategy intended. The escalation continued when Sheriff Collins and 2 deputies arrived at Margaret Sullivan's home, ostensibly to investigate reports of unauthorized access to county records, a transparent attempt to intimidate the Historical Society's research efforts. Victoria monitored this development through her information network, noting it as the first application of official pressure against identified opposition figures. By midday, Judge Holloway reported that his regulatory complaints had mysteriously disappeared from filing systems, while the state officials he had contacted were suddenly unreachable. Atlantic Horizon's influence extended further into government structures than initially assessed, confirming Victoria's decision to avoid conventional legal challenges as primary strategy. These developments necessitated acceleration of Phase 3, creating visible evidence of Atlantic Horizon's unauthorized harbor modifications that couldn't be easily concealed or explained away. Victoria activated a secure communication channel to coordinate with Rivera, who had established position on a fishing vessel maintaining pattern near Shorebreak's outer harbor. At precisely 3:17 p.m., when Atlantic Horizon's attention was focused on the community center where the Historical Society had scheduled a public information session about preservation regulations, Victoria executed the operation's most audacious element. Using specialized equipment concealed within the lighthouse's weather monitoring systems, she deployed a sophisticated underwater drone that had been waiting dormant since Rivera's arrival. The device moved silently through harbor waters, documenting the extensive unauthorized modifications Atlantic Horizon had made to the seabed, alterations designed to facilitate submerged approaches by vessels seeking to avoid coastal monitoring. Most significantly, it captured imagery of recently installed underwater camera and sensor arrays, inconsistent with legitimate marina development, but perfectly aligned with smuggling operation security protocols. The drone completed its mission without detection, returning to its concealment location with comprehensive evidence that would be impossible to dismiss as merely concerned citizens' paranoia. Victoria transmitted the data through secure channels to both Isaac Chen's Coast Guard connections and Judge Holloway's federal contacts, carefully routing the information through proxies that couldn't be traced to the lighthouse. By evening, the impact of this intelligence was becoming visible in Atlantic Horizon's operations. Harlan called an emergency meeting of security personnel, surveillance of community members intensified, and preliminary preparations for accelerated construction activities suggested they were attempting to establish irreversible progress before potential regulatory intervention. Victoria observed these developments with the calculated assessment of a tactical commander. Atlantic Horizon was responding predictably to perceived threats, adjusting their timeline and security posture while seeking to identify opposition sources. Their behavior revealed professional discipline, but also increasing pressure from external controllers demanding results despite unexpected complications. Most significantly, their attention was now divided between multiple potential threat vectors: regulatory challenges, community opposition, communication disruptions, and evidence collection, exactly as Victoria had strategically engineered. This created the operational space necessary for the most critical phase of her counter-strategy, documenting direct evidence of criminal activity that would trigger immediate federal intervention. As darkness fell over Shorebreak Point, Victoria prepared for the operation's most dangerous phase. Atlantic Horizon's increasing pressure on community members had accelerated her timeline, requiring more direct countermeasures than initially planned. The organization's reaction to interference had revealed both sophisticated capabilities and concerning willingness to employ intimidation against civilians, confirming her assessment that they represented a legitimate threat requiring specialized opposition. Victoria Hargrove, once Commander Viper Verdon, checked her specialized equipment with practiced efficiency while mentally reviewing contingency options. The coming hours would determine whether Shorebreak Point remained an independent coastal community or became another conquered territory in an expanding criminal network. What Atlantic Horizon couldn't possibly anticipate was that their seemingly routine intimidation of a small town had triggered response from the most formidable tactical mind they would ever encounter. The ultimatum arrived at dawn, delivered by Sheriff Collins himself. Victoria received the official-looking envelope with the trembling hands and confused expression expected of an elderly woman confronted by unexpected legal proceedings. Atlantic Horizon Partners hereby serves notice of eminent domain proceedings regarding the historic lighthouse property, Collins recited mechanically, his gaze avoiding Victoria's. Engineering surveys have identified structural concerns requiring immediate professional assessment. For public safety, you're required to vacate the premises within 48 hours. Victoria allowed appropriate distress to show on her features. But, "This is my home, Sheriff. The lighthouse is under historical protection. They can't simply take it." Collins shifted uncomfortably. "The town council approved emergency measures last night in a special session. I'm just delivering the notice, Mrs. Hargrove." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Look, if you need help finding new accommodations, my wife's sister has a spare room." "That won't be necessary," Victoria interrupted, her voice wavering convincingly. "The Historical Society will surely contest this. There must be some mistake." After Collins departed, Victoria secured her cottage before activating counter-surveillance measures. The accelerated timeline confirmed her tactical assessment. Atlantic Horizon had identified the lighthouse as both strategic observation post and potential center of resistance. Their move to seize it indicated they recognized the threat it posed to their operation, though they still hadn't connected that threat to the seemingly harmless elderly caretaker. Through her secure communication channel, Victoria contacted both Rivera and Isaac Chen, updating them on this significant development. Atlantic Horizon's legal maneuver necessitated immediate implementation of their contingency response, rather than the more measured approach originally planned. The Historical Society's emergency meeting convened at Judge Holloway's home an hour later, with Victoria arriving last, demonstrating appropriate elderly agitation about the eviction notice. The gathered community members showed visible outrage at this latest development. "It's completely illegal," Judge Holloway declared, examining the documents Victoria had brought. Emergency declarations require documented public safety hazards and engineering assessments from certified inspectors. This paperwork contains a neither. Margaret Sullivan nodded vigorously. They're obviously targeting Victoria because the lighthouse provides clear observation of their harbour activities. It's pure intimidation. What can we do? Thomas Jenkins asked, his expression grim. The council's already approved it, and Sheriff Collins is clearly following Atlantic Horizon's directives. Victoria observed the discussion with outward distress and internal tactical assessment. The group's anger provided necessary community, opposition that would occupy Atlantic Horizon's attention while her more specialized countermeasures were implemented. Perhaps, she suggested with careful hesitation, we should focus on documenting what's happening rather than just legal challenges. If proper authorities could see Atlantic Horizon's actual activities instead of just their paperwork. Judge Holloway turned to her with newfound respect. Mrs. Hargrove makes an excellent point. Preservation of evidence may be our most effective strategy at this stage. The meeting produced a coordinated community response plan. Residents would establish round-the-clock observation teams documenting Atlantic Horizon's activities, while Judge Holloway pursued emergency injunctions through his federal court contacts. Most critically for Victoria's strategy, the Historical Society agreed to organize a public demonstration at the lighthouse that evening, creating legitimate reason for increased community presence at the strategic location. As the meeting concluded, Victoria approached Margaret privately. I'm concerned about some historical documents and artifacts in the Lighthouse Museum, she confided. Perhaps the Historical Society could help relocate them temporarily. I'd feel better knowing they're secured elsewhere if I'm forced to leave. Margaret agreed immediately, promising to arrange for volunteers to assist that afternoon. This arrangement would provide cover for Victoria to remove her specialized equipment and intelligence materials while maintaining her vulnerable elderly persona. By mid-morning, Atlantic Horizon's response to the planned community demonstration became evident. Security personnel established checkpoints on approaches to the lighthouse, ostensibly for public safety, but actually restricting access to the strategic location. Mayor Wilford issued a public statement urging residents to respect the legal process and avoid unnecessary confrontation that might damage Shorebreak's community fabric. Victoria monitored these developments from her cottage, while methodically preparing for multiple contingencies. The secured cases containing her most critical documentation and specialized equipment were disguised as ordinary storage boxes labeled Lighthouse Historical Records, ready for removal by Historical Society volunteers who would unknowingly transport them to secure alternative locations. At noon, an unexpected development accelerated Victoria's timeline. Through her surveillance systems, she detected 3 unmarked vans arriving at Atlantic Horizon's headquarters, discharging personnel carrying specialized equipment consistent with advanced counter-surveillance and tactical operations. Their movement patterns and equipment handling indicated military or specialized law enforcement background, a significant escalation in Atlantic Horizon's security capabilities. Victoria immediately recognized the tactical implications. Atlantic Horizon had imported specialized personnel to locate and neutralize the technological interference affecting their operations. These teams would systematically sweep Shorebreak Point with advanced detection equipment, eventually identifying the lighthouse as the source of disruption. This development forced Victoria to initiate her most high-risk contingency plan, direct evidence collection of criminal activity that would trigger immediate federal intervention. Through her secure channel, she transmitted new operational parameters to Rivera, who acknowledged with the terse efficiency of an experienced tactical operator. When Margaret Sullivan arrived with Historical Society volunteers to help preserve lighthouse artifacts, Victoria guided them with the careful precision of a commander, disguising tactical deployment as civilian activity. Each antique or document collection concealed critical equipment or evidence, transported under innocent cover to distributed safe locations throughout Shorebreak Point. "You seem remarkably composed, Victoria," Margaret observed as they carefully packed maritime records. "I'd be devastated if forced from my home like this." Victoria allowed genuine emotion to surface briefly. "This lighthouse has been my sanctuary for 20 years, she replied softly. "But buildings can be reclaimed. Communities are worth preserving at greater cost." By late afternoon, Victoria's most critical systems and documentation had been secured, distributed among multiple locations known only to her. The lighthouse itself had been subtly modified, with passive surveillance systems remaining operational but untraceable, powered by independent batteries and transmitting to secure receivers throughout Shorebreak Point. As evening approached, residents began gathering near the lighthouse despite Atlantic Horizon's security checkpoints. The demonstration grew organically, with families bringing children, elderly citizens in wheelchairs, and local business owners joining together in peaceful but determined opposition. Their presence created the perfect operational cover for Victoria's most critical countermeasures. Under cover of legitimate community activity, Rivera and two trusted associates he had recruited from former Coastal Ranger contacts established surveillance positions covering Atlantic Horizon's primary operational areas. Their mission was precisely defined: document irrefutable evidence of criminal activity that would justify immediate federal intervention. Victoria herself maintained her elderly lighthouse keeper persona, addressing the gathered community with apparent emotional distress while secretly coordinating the most sophisticated intelligence operation Shorebreak Point had ever witnessed. Her positioning provided optimal observation of Atlantic Horizon's reaction to the demonstration while maintaining her cover identity. The tactical gambit produced exactly the response Victoria had anticipated. James Harlan himself arrived with enhanced security, confronting the demonstrators with professional courtesy layered over barely concealed frustration. His presence at the demonstration, rather than overseeing nighttime harbor operations, confirmed Victoria's assessment of Atlantic Horizon's divided attention and resource allocation. "Your concerns are understood," Harlan addressed the crowd with practiced corporate diplomacy. "Atlantic Horizon values community input, which is why we've established the advisory committee. However, safety assessments indicate structural concerns with the lighthouse that require immediate professional attention." From her position among elderly residents, Victoria observed Harlan's security personnel with professional assessment. Their positioning and communication patterns revealed heightened alert status and tactical readiness beyond standard corporate security, confirming they anticipated potential threats beyond peaceful demonstration. Judge Holloway stepped forward as community spokesperson, his judicial bearing commanding natural authority. "Mr. Harlan, we've reviewed your documentation and found it legally insufficient for eminent domain proceedings. The lighthouse has undergone regular structural assessment through the Historical Preservation Program, most recently 3 months ago, with no safety concerns identified. As this confrontation unfolded exactly as Victoria had orchestrated, her secure communication device vibrated with Rivera's signal. The operation's most critical phase was executing successfully under cover of the public distraction she had created. Harlan's response to Judge Holloway carried the smooth assurance of someone accustomed to overwhelming opposition through superior resources. "We respect the community's attachment to historical properties. Atlantic Horizon is committed to preservation through modernization. I'm personally authorized to offer Mrs. Hargrove significantly upgraded accommodation as compensation for temporary relocation during necessary safety evaluations." Victoria stepped forward with apparent elderly hesitation, playing her role perfectly while Rivera's team documented Atlantic Horizon's most damning activities. "Mr. Harlan," she began, her voice carrying appropriate quaver, "I've maintained this lighthouse for 20 years. If there were structural concerns, I'd be the first to notice them." The confrontation continued with carefully measured intensity, community members expressing determined opposition, while Atlantic Horizon's representatives maintained corporate composure layered over growing frustration. Throughout this perfectly orchestrated distraction, Victoria monitored Rivera's operation through discrete signals, indicating successful documentation of multiple federal violations occurring simultaneously at Atlantic Horizon's harbor facilities. Demonstration concluded at sunset with apparent stalemate, Atlantic Horizon maintaining their legal position while the community vowed continued opposition. As residents dispersed, Victoria returned to her cottage with the appropriate weariness of an elderly woman following emotional confrontation, aware that Atlantic Horizon's surveillance remained focused on her movements. Only when her cottage was secured and counter-surveillance measures activated did Victoria receive Rivera's complete report through their secure channel. The operation had succeeded beyond tactical projections. While Atlantic Horizon's attention focused on the lighthouse demonstration, Rivera's team had documented 3 critical activities. First, specialized communications equipment being installed at the harbor master's office, consistent with international trafficking coordination rather than marina development. Second, underwater deployment of sophisticated sensor systems designed to detect Coast Guard sonar patterns, technology exclusively used by organizations seeking to evade maritime law enforcement. Most significantly, direct evidence of Atlantic Horizon. Security personnel removing authentic Coast Guard identification from a vessel and replacing it with falsified credentials. A federal offense providing immediate justification for law enforcement. Intervention. This intelligence had already been transmitted through secure channels to both Coast Guard Investigative Service and FBI organized crime units, using Isaac Chen's verified credentials to ensure immediate attention. The evidence was irrefutable, extensively documented, and transmitted through channels that couldn't be traced to Victoria's lighthouse operation. Victoria processed this tactical success with the measured assessment of an experienced commander. Atlantic Horizon's position had been fatally compromised, though they didn't yet realize it. Federal intervention was now inevitable, but timing remained critical. The organization would become most dangerous in the coming hours as they implemented accelerated operations before regulatory interference could materialize. As if confirming this assessment, Victoria's perimeter security system alerted her to multiple vehicles approaching the lighthouse from different directions. A coordinated movement suggesting more than standard surveillance. Atlantic Horizon had transitioned from intimidation to direct action against what they perceived as the center of community resistance. Victoria activated her final contingency measures with practiced efficiency. The lighthouse itself had been prepared for precisely this scenario, with evidence of her true capabilities removed and distributed to secure locations. What remained was the carefully crafted persona of Victoria Hargrove, elderly lighthouse keeper whose only apparent threat was community connection rather than tactical expertise. When sharp knocks came at her door minutes later, Victoria was prepared. She activated the cottage's concealed recording systems before answering with apparent elderly confusion. Sheriff Collins stood on her porch, flanked by 4 Atlantic Horizon security personnel whose posture and equipment suggested paramilitary background rather than corporate security. "Mrs. Hargrove," Collins began, discomfort evident in his expression. "I have an emergency evacuation order due to immediate structural concerns identified by county engineers. You need to come with us now for your own safety." Victoria allowed. Appropriate distress and confusion to show on her features, while noting the security team's tactical positioning and communications equipment. This wasn't mere intimidation, but extraction. Atlantic Horizon had identified the lighthouse as significant opposition center and determined to remove its elderly keeper from community access. "At this hour?" she protested with convincing elderly indignation. "Surely this can wait until morning. I need to pack my medications and personal items." The security team leader stepped forward, his manner professionally efficient but with underlying tension that suggested urgency beyond stated concerns. "Ma'am, we have orders to secure the lighthouse immediately. Transportation and accommodation have been arranged. You'll be completely comfortable while necessary inspections are completed." Victoria recognized the tactical approach immediately. Forced removal disguised as safety concerns, with transportation to location where she would be effectively isolated from the community and any evidence of her opposition effectively contained. Atlantic Horizon had identified her as more significant than expected, but still fundamentally misunderstood exactly who they were attempting to neutralize. With perfect maintenance of her elderly persona, Victoria projected anxious compliance, while implementing the final phase of her counter-strategy. The specialized equipment still concealed within the lighthouse was transmitting everything to both Rivera's team and federal authorities, while Victoria herself presented the perfect image of a vulnerable elderly woman being intimidated by corporate security. "I'll need my heart medication," she insisted with convincing elderly worry, "and some personal items. Surely you can allow an old woman a few minutes to gather essentials." The confrontation was building toward critical decision point. Atlantic Horizon's security team clearly had orders to remove her immediately, while Victoria needed to maintain her vulnerable persona while ensuring their actions constituted documentable. Intimidation of an elderly civilian, further evidence for federal intervention. Sheriff Collins, visibly uncomfortable with the situation, intervened. "Give Mrs. Hargrove 10 minutes to gather her things. We're not barbarians." As Victoria turned to collect her essential medications, she activated the final signal to Rivera's team. Atlantic Horizon had committed to actionable intimidation of civilians that would accelerate federal response. The organization that had sought to exploit Shorebreak Point had unwittingly sealed its own fate by targeting the one person most capable of orchestrating its destruction. The endgame had begun, with Atlantic Horizon believing they were neutralizing a simple community opposition figure while actually confronting the legendary commander, whose tactical brilliance had once dismantled criminal networks across 3 continents. Dawn broke over Shorebreak Point with unusual commotion. Victoria Hargrove observed the unfolding activity from a cottage 3 blocks from the lighthouse, where Margaret Sullivan had insisted she stay after her traumatic eviction. Through the window, she noted Coast Guard vessels entering the harbor, while dark SUVs with federal markings established positions around Atlantic Horizon's headquarters. The operation's final phase was executing precisely as she had calculated. Victoria's forced removal from the lighthouse, documented by her concealed systems and witnessed by concerned neighbors, had provided the last compelling evidence needed to trigger immediate federal intervention. The apparent vulnerability of an elderly woman being intimidated by corporate security had accelerated response timelines that might otherwise have been delayed by bureaucratic process. "I still can't believe they forced you out in the middle of the night," Margaret fumed, setting a cup of tea before Victoria. "Judge Holloway is absolutely livid. He's filed emergency injunctions with 3 different courts." Victoria maintained her elderly persona despite the tactical success unfolding before her. "Such a fuss over an old woman and an old lighthouse," she murmured, allowing her hands to tremble slightly as she reached for the teacup. "I do worry about what they might be doing to the historical artifacts we couldn't remove." Margaret patted her hand reassuringly. "Don't you worry about that. Thomas Jenkins and half the town are documenting everything Atlantic Horizon does. They won't get away with destroying our heritage." The Historical Society president couldn't possibly know that the heritage Victoria, most concerned about protecting, involved sophisticated surveillance equipment still transmitting from concealed locations throughout the lighthouse. Equipment now providing federal agencies with real-time intelligence on Atlantic Horizon's increasingly panicked activities. Victoria's secure communication device vibrated discreetly. The message from Rivera was characteristically brief. "Federal operation active. 3 jurisdictions. Complete surveillance established. Primary targets contained." Through seemingly innocent conversation with Margaret, Victoria gathered additional intelligence about community developments. Sheriff Collins had been seen entering the federal command post established at the Harbour Master's office. Mayor Wilford had attempted to leave town on an urgent family matter, but was currently engaged in extended conversation with FBI agents. Most significantly, James Harlan and 4 senior Atlantic Horizon executives had been escorted from their headquarters in handcuffs. "Such dramatic events for our quiet town," Victoria commented, maintaining her elderly bewilderment while assessing these developments with tactical precision. The federal response was more comprehensive than even she had anticipated, suggesting Atlantic Horizon's criminal enterprise extended beyond what her intelligence had initially identified. When a knock came at Margaret's door mid-morning, Victoria was unsurprised to see Isaac Chen standing on the porch with a young woman whose bearing and credentials identified her as federal law enforcement. "Mrs. Hargrove," the woman addressed Victoria directly. "I'm Special Agent Diana Foster, FBI. I'd like to speak with you regarding your experiences with Atlantic Horizon partners." Victoria noted Chen's subtle nod, confirming the agent's legitimacy, before responding with appropriate elderly hesitation. "Of course, though I'm not sure how much help I can be. Recent events have been rather confusing for someone my age." Agent Foster's professional demeanor softened slightly. "We understand you've been through a difficult experience, ma'am. Your statement could be valuable in building our case against those responsible." The interview that followed was a masterclass in Victoria's deep cover capabilities. She provided precise, useful information about Atlantic Horizon's intimidation tactics while maintaining the persona of a somewhat confused elderly woman recounting traumatic events. Each detail was carefully calibrated, specific enough to assist the federal case while revealing nothing about her own sophisticated counter-operations. "Mrs. Hargrove managed the Lighthouse Museum for 20 years. Margaret interjected at one point, clearly concerned that Victoria's apparent fragility might undermine her credibility. "She knows more about Shorebreak's history and maritime operations than anyone." Agent Foster nodded respectfully. "The Historical Society's documentation has been extremely helpful to our investigation. Your community's organized response provided critical evidence." When the interview concluded, Chen remained behind briefly, ostensibly to check on Victoria's well-being. Once they had privacy, he provided a comprehensive situation update with professional efficiency. "Atlantic Horizon's operation extended well beyond Shorebreak Point," he explained quietly. "Your intelligence exposed a major smuggling network with connections to 3 international criminal organizations. Federal authorities had fragments of the pattern, but couldn't connect the elements until your evidence provided the central framework." Victoria absorbed this with measured satisfaction. "Casualties?" "None," Chen confirmed. "The simultaneous multi-agency intervention prevented escalation. 27 arrests so far, including Atlantic Horizon's entire executive team and their security leadership. The community's status? Secure. Federal protective presence will continue during investigation, but immediate threat has been neutralized. Property seizures will be challenged in court, but likely reversed under criminal enterprise legislation. Victoria nodded slightly. And our operational footprint? Chen's expression conveyed professional appreciation. Completely contained. All specialized equipment has been removed or permanently deactivated. Commander Rivera and his associates departed during federal arrival confusion. Your role appears exclusively as victimized elderly civilian caught in corporate intimidation. This confirmation completed Victoria's tactical requirements. Her counter-strategy had succeeded comprehensively. Atlantic Horizon's criminal operation had been dismantled, shore breakpoint secured, and her cover identity preserved intact. The legendary commander had orchestrated another perfect operation, while remaining invisible to both opposition and allies. "Thank you, Isaac," she said simply. "Your assistance was invaluable." Chen studied her with undisguised respect. 20 years, maintaining deep cover while building comprehensive contingency preparations without any operational requirement or active threat. Your discipline remains unmatched, Commander. Victoria allowed a rare, genuine smile to briefly replace her elderly facade. Not discipline, evolution. Victoria Hargrove isn't merely cover identity anymore. She became real during these 20 years. The afternoon brought community transformation as federal authorities established public information points explaining the criminal enterprise that had nearly engulfed Shore Breakpoint. Residents gathered in small groups, expressions shifting between shock at their narrow escape and pride in their community's resistance. Judge Holloway visited Margaret's cottage with news that federal courts had already invalidated Atlantic Horizon's lighthouse seizure. "You can return home immediately, Victoria," he announced triumphantly. "I've arranged for volunteers to help you move back in." Victoria accepted this with appropriate elderly gratitude while inwardly calculating optimal timing for her return. The lighthouse would require thorough inspection to ensure all specialized equipment had been properly removed or permanently disguised as ordinary fixtures. Rivera's team was handling this critical task under cover of structural assessment authorized by federal authorities. "Perhaps tomorrow morning would be best," she suggested gently. "These old bones need recovery time after all the excitement." By evening, Shore Breakpoint had achieved tentative equilibrium between federal investigation activities and community restoration efforts. Victoria observed these developments from Margaret's porch, presenting the image of an elderly woman resting after traumatic events while actually conducting final operational assessment. The federal response had exceeded tactical projections, suggesting Atlantic Horizon's criminal enterprise had been under partial surveillance before Victoria's evidence provided actionable cause for intervention. This explained the comprehensive multi-agency response and the senior federal officials who had arrived to oversee the operation personally. As darkness fell, Rivera made final contact through their secure channel before departing the area. "Lighthouse. Clear. All systems removed or neutralized. Cover integrity maintained. Operation complete." This confirmation allowed Victoria to finally release the hypervigilance that had maintained her tactical edge throughout the confrontation. Atlantic Horizon had been neutralized, Shore Breakpoint secured, and her cover identity preserved. The legendary commander could return to retirement, her existence once again hidden beneath the carefully crafted persona of Victoria Hargrove, elderly lighthouse keeper. The following morning brought unexpected ceremonial element to Victoria's return to the lighthouse. What she had anticipated as quiet relocation with Margaret's assistance became community procession, with residents lining the path from town to lighthouse, applauding as she passed. Children presented hand-drawn cards, thanking the lighthouse lady for standing up to the bad corporation. Victoria maintained appropriate elderly humility while navigating this unanticipated public recognition. The community had constructed narrative that placed her at the center of resistance against Atlantic Horizon, the vulnerable but determined, elderly woman whose courage inspired broader opposition. This perception, while dramatically misunderstanding her actual role, provided perfect cover for her true capabilities. No one would ever connect Victoria Hargrove, the somewhat frail lighthouse keeper celebrated for simple courage, with Commander Viper Verdon, the legendary tactical genius whose expertise had orchestrated Atlantic Horizon's destruction. Judge Holloway addressed the gathered community once Victoria had been ceremonially restored to her lighthouse home. Mrs. Hargrove's steadfast commitment to our heritage represented the spirit that preserved Shorebreak Point from corporate exploitation. When those with power and resources targeted our most vulnerable citizen, they discovered that in this community no one stands alone. Victoria accepted the community's gratitude with appropriate emotion, playing her role perfectly while inwardly appreciating the irony. Atlantic Horizon had indeed targeted Shorebreak Point's most vulnerable appearing resident, and that fatal miscalculation had triggered their comprehensive destruction. In the weeks that followed, Victoria observed Shorebreak Point's gradual return to normalcy. Federal investigators completed evidence collection. The Lighthouse Museum reopened to visitors, and community attention shifted to legitimate development plans that would preserve the town's character while supporting sustainable growth. 1 month after Atlantic Horizon's neutralization, Victoria stood at the lighthouse lantern room, surveying the harbor below with the same vigilant attention she had maintained for 20 years. The specialized surveillance equipment had been removed, but her natural observational skills remained exceptional despite her age. The knock at the lighthouse door below wasn't unexpected. Victoria had been anticipating this final interaction. Since federal operations concluded, she descended carefully, maintaining her elderly movements even in private, the discipline of deep cover having become second nature over decades. Agent Foster stood on the porch, now in casual clothing rather than her FBI attire. Her expression suggested this visit wasn't official business. "Mrs. Hargrove," she greeted Victoria with respectful formality, "I hope you're recovering well from recent events." Victoria invited her inside with elderly courtesy, serving tea with deliberately unhurried movements. While assessing the purpose behind this unofficial visit, Foster accepted the tea before speaking with careful precision. "Before leaving Shorebreak Point, I wanted to personally express appreciation for your cooperation during our investigation." "I only did what any citizen should," Victoria replied modestly. Foster studied her with measured assessment before continuing. "Our investigation revealed something interesting. Atlantic Horizon's internal security assessments identified the lighthouse as significant tactical vulnerability to their operation. Specifically, they were concerned about its surveillance potential and strategic position." Victoria maintained and perfect cover, her expression revealing only elderly confusion. "How strange. It's just an old building with historical significance." "Indeed," Foster agreed, her gaze never leaving Victoria's face. "Yet their operational leadership insisted on prioritizing its acquisition and your removal above other security concerns, almost as if they sensed some specific threat they couldn't quite identify." The conversation had entered dangerous territory. Foster was clearly probing beyond official investigation parameters. Victoria calculated optimal response while maintaining her elderly persona. "Criminal organizations often develop paranoia," she offered mildly. "Perhaps commanding views over a harbor create irrational concern in those with something to hide." Foster nodded slowly. "Perhaps." She set down her teacup before continuing with deliberate casualness. "During advanced training at Quantico, we studied certain classified historical operations against coastal criminal networks, particularly innovative tactical approaches from the specialized unit known as the Coastal Rangers. Victoria's expression revealed nothing beyond polite interest. Despite the direct reference to her former command, their leader had distinctive methodology. Foster continued carefully, distributed resistance rather than centralized confrontation, strategic application of precisely calibrated pressure rather than overwhelming force, creating circumstances where opposition defeated itself through predictable responses to unpredictable stimuli. The description perfectly captured Victoria's tactical philosophy during her command years, but she merely smiled with elderly bemusement. Sounds very sophisticated for an old lighthouse keeper to understand. Foster returned the smile, though. Her eyes remained evaluative. The unit's commander was officially lost during a classified operation 4 decades ago. Body never recovered. Victoria allowed appropriate confusion to show on her features. How terrible, though I'm not sure why you're sharing this history with me. Foster studied her for a long moment before nodding slightly, a gesture of professional respect rather than acceptance of Victoria's performance. No reason in particular, just interesting historical context about specialized approaches to coastal security. She rose to depart. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Hargrove. Shorebreak Point is fortunate to have such a dedicated lighthouse. Keeper. After Foster's departure, Victoria returned to the lantern room, her expression finally revealing the tactical assessment she had maintained throughout the conversation. The agent clearly harbored suspicions about Victoria's true identity, but had chosen not to pursue them, whether from professional courtesy to a legendary predecessor or lack of actionable evidence, remained unclear. Victoria surveyed the harbour with the same vigilant attention that had defined both her command career and her retirement. Shorebreak Point had returned to peaceful routine, its residents unaware how close they had come to becoming unwilling participants in international criminal enterprise. More significantly, they remained completely unaware that their beloved elderly lighthouse keeper had orchestrated one final perfect operation after decades of retirement. As sunset painted the harbour with golden light, Victoria allowed herself rare moment of philosophical reflection. Commander Viper Verdon had disappeared 40 years ago, her legendary tactical brilliance fading into classified history. Victoria Hargrove had emerged instead, apparently unremarkable elderly woman whose only notable characteristic was dedication to a historic lighthouse. Yet when threat emerged to the community that had provided peaceful sanctuary for her retirement, the commander's undiminished capabilities had seamlessly reintegrated with Victoria's established identity. Not resurrection of former self, but evolution into something neither identity could have anticipated. Tactical brilliance applied for protection rather than military objective. As darkness fell, Victoria activated the lighthouse beacon with the same meticulous care she had shown for 20 years. To residents of Shorebreak Point, the rhythmic flash represented comforting continuity after recent disruption, their trusted lighthouse keeper maintaining maritime tradition despite corporate threats and federal interventions. None would ever suspect that the beam sweeping over coastal waters was maintained by the most brilliant tactical mind to ever command special operations. A legend who had found unexpected fulfillment in her cover identity's simple commitment to community and heritage. The legendary commander had orchestrated her final perfect operation, and Victoria Hargrove had protected her chosen home. As these dual aspects of her identity achieved harmonious integration, the woman who had been both tactical genius and lighthouse keeper continued her vigilant observation of Shorebreak Point, now secure in knowledge that her most significant victory had been accomplished without sacrifice of the peaceful life she had crafted so carefully over 20 years of meticulous discipline. The lighthouse beam swept its protective arc across the harbour, guided by the steady hand of a woman who had finally found perfect balance between extraordinary capabilities and ordinary contentment. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.